And Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of the understanding, just some discussion going on.
Yeah, Andy, I guess I didn't see any agenda come out either.
Oh, I apologize.
Not sure that
it
was
would have been. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my calendar invites either. So I apologize for that, guys.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're at our time. Do we know if we should be expecting Bob Salinger or Andrew Perky?
Andrew Perky told me he'd be attending.
Okay. I do know that Fran will not be attending today.
Yeah, and let me look for Bob Salinger. I didn't hear a no from him, but I'm just seeing if I got a response. I didn't get a response. But we don't need quorum or anything for this.
Right. And so the purpose of this working group call is to work on this acquisitions component, right? And we did agree in the regularly scheduled meeting that this wasn't going to be a space where we vote on things and make decisions, that we are here to work on a proposal that we can then bring forward to the regularly scheduled larger group. So that's kind of the hope for the day, that we can come to consensus on a proposal that will then be voted on during our next regularly scheduled meeting. Is that everybody's understanding?
Welcome, I'll redrop that agenda again in the chat now for everyone, by the way. Apologies for that.
Appreciate that, Andy. Thank you. Oh, looks like we do have Bob. Just joined. Welcome, Bob.
Hello.
Great. And Andy, you're going to put that agenda in the chat. Is that what you said?
Correct. I'm going to attach it right now.
And the reason that the meeting is looking the way it is when we decided, or we're told that we need to have all the same public notice and all of the same requirements as our regularly scheduled meeting. That's why we didn't create a specific work group and decided to just invite any MAC members that are able and willing to join.
We have to just send the agenda over email. My team just seems to not be submitting it through this meeting, so apologies for that.
All right, Andy. Well, I think we can probably get started. We all understand what we're here to do today, right? And Bob, as you've just joined, the purpose of this meeting is not to make any decisions, but to try to come up with consensus and a proposal to bring forward to the entire Mitigation Advisory Committee during the regularly scheduled meetings. So just some table setting there, what we're here to do. Andy, did you provide the author's report and the statute in that pre-meeting packet?
We didn't send out a pre-meeting because we didn't want to do any discussion materials, but we have the author's report and the Senate bill from last meeting, that pre-meeting packet that was in there. So
okay, great. Well, I guess we'll just get started. I haven't seen the email come through, Andy, but in the interest of time and keeping things moving, we'll just dive into the subject at hand here. So we're here to talk about what acquisitions could or should look like under this mitigation fund. And some of those things are kind of clearly outlined in statute. And the two that I think would be worth focusing on are water rights, which are clearly outlined, and how we deal with water rights acquisitions and how do we assure permanence in that space. And then around conservation easements, and we should also discuss fee acquisition and what that would, or could, or should or shouldn't look like. And then this idea of permanence as well, because until we have the HCP in place, this committee is temporary. So I know that whatever we do decide to fund, we want to make sure it is more durable than this committee if the HCP is not created and agreed upon. Kristen, is there anything you'd like to add to kind of prime the conversation for today?
Sorry, was that directed to me or
Yeah.
I didn't hear a name, but then
Yeah,
everyone
I'm
said it.
sorry,
I was
yeah.
like, oh, that might have been me. No, I think that covers it. And I think we've got a few questions to kind of facilitate the process. And just as Chad said, I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak and have their perspectives heard. So let's try to be efficient and to the point. And I know a lot of these topics are things we've discussed for a number of months, if not over a year now. And this is just a good opportunity to really pull it together into a strong proposal to bring forward to the full committee for final discussion and vote. So thanks, Chad, for facilitating.
Thanks, Kristen. Mark, I see your hand is up, and I'm glad you're here today with your experience in conservation easements and your work with TNC. I think it'll be really valuable.
Yeah, thanks. I guess just a couple questions. You know, obviously I wasn't part of the authors group or the private forest accords. I don't have the benefit of the conversations that some of you all had before. But after the last meeting, I did go back and read through some of the other documents that we'd put together, and I guess what struck me is there's different language in different documents. So if you look in the OARs, for example, it says eligible projects include, but are not limited to, supporting acquisition of land and interest in land, including conservation easements to protect, enhance, restore riparian areas or other critical habitat functions for the HCP covered species. So I just share that's in the OARs. And then in the expenditure framework that we worked on together, one of the mitigation activities includes, but not limited to, acquisition of land and interest in land, including conservation easements. So I guess I just share that to say that we've got kind of a range of guidance in the different documents that may or may not be entirely consistent, or at least are slightly different, that are out there.
That's a great point, Mark. And I think Andy can speak to the fact that we will need to do some rules revisions. Again, this process, as you know, moved very quickly, and there may be some things that we need to clean up prior to the next solicitation. So Andy, do you want to talk about some of the things that may be included in a rules revision?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chad. Thank you. So yeah, we are like keeping a short list of rules revision. I'm not sure if we're gonna make it before this solicitation comes out. We're trying just to generate a robust enough list that we don't have to go back, multiple times in the next year or two to make some revisions. I would envision after we have a few working group meetings now, probably following the next solicitation, we'll approach it in next year, actually, for rule revision. But I am keeping a short list of that right now.
Right.
And I think, Mark, the question is whether these rules are consistent with the statute. The statute obviously has primacy, but I don't know that the statute, given the kind of blanket authorization at the end, precludes the acquisition of land, right? That it's just a question of kind of the prioritization and the approach of this group about, how and under what circumstances that makes sense. And it seems likely to me that that's the topic of conversation for the day.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So any other comments from anybody before we kind of dive into, I think what we need to come with at the end of this meeting is what types of acquisitions are we all agreeing we're going to move forward and develop a program around, and what are we going to not address, and what are we going to say that's not going to be included in the scope. I think that would be really helpful for Andy too, to be able to get started on what this acquisitions program. I'd hesitate there. I don't mean that we're going to have a separate program or a separate channel for acquisitions. They will likely just be compared to any other project type. I don't think it needs to be a separate solicitation or a separate review. So Kristen,
Sorry, looking for the hand raise button there. I think I'd like to underscore that point that Chad just made. I would like to see acquisitions encompassed in the same solicitation process as the other types of grant applications. And I say that because I think as an entity that's charged primarily with mitigation responsibilities, there isn't a clear-cut, easy way to necessarily compare the uplift of X project in this geography against this totally different kind of project in a different geography. I don't think we have the capacity to perfectly evaluate, the magnitude of uplift. But I think we are charged with doing the best we can to assure we're maximizing the outcomes on the ground with the funding we spend. And if we identify separate tracks for the funding, I worry that it would be difficult for us to achieve that. So despite the complexity of maybe having it housed in the same solicitation, I do think it's an important part in order to effectively sort of push the mission forward. I would, while I have the floor, I guess also say I would be very excited and pleased for water acquisitions to be included, just as a place to start the conversation. I think given the needs of the species that are covered under the HCP, adequate in-stream flow and related water quality benefits that come with that seem squarely within the charge of benefiting the species covered. So I would throw that one out maybe first to see if we have consensus around that and the value of it.
very good. I'll let Heath respond, and then we can talk as a group if we want to add that one to the, we are certainly going to focus on kind of category here. Heath?
Well, why don't we just proceed with that? I can come back to my point.
Okay.
For the record, I agree.
Yeah. Well, I do as well. So I'd like to give Mark, Bob, and Andrew an opportunity to weigh in as well.
Well, I think in-stream or water rights acquisition totally fits. I think it might also help us to have some sort of initial statement that basically says, any acquisition like the other mitigation activities that we're considering has to have clear and direct benefit for the covered species. And that's sort of the bar that then you can talk about what types of acquisitions may or may not be appropriate.
Yeah, and related to that, Mark, I'd want to make sure that any water acquisition documents how it's going to generate real wet water in stream in that reach. I recall the proposal on the Umpqua that we looked at might have been a tributary of the Umpqua, where there was an assertion of a certain CFS of benefit by simply bringing the diversion into compliance with its water right. And I would like to see transactions and us to set a fairly high bar that it really demonstrates how it's additional water based on legal historic use of water.
Agreed.
How do you do that, Andrew? Like, does somebody at ODF and W have to due diligence that a little bit?
Yeah, ODFW and Oregon Water Resources Department too. I think we're going to want to tap into their understanding of how water is administered in that stream reach.
Great.
Do you think that Mr. Spurka might be a component then of your prep for our, grant review process? That for water rights acquisition proposals, that there would be a path through OWRD for that?
I'd be, we're gonna have to do due diligence on any acquisition process, no matter what. It's hard pressed to say there's any path to not sidestep the committee from approving it. I think just staying within what the committee's gonna approve, we're gonna have to do, and not let another program approve it. But
well, it's not so much approval, but it would be really helpful to know. I've done a lot of water rights work over time as well, and it's sometimes difficult to know relative to the priority right whether you're actually putting water in the stream and when.
Yeah.
And it seems like if we get one of those applications, it'd be kind of nice to have somebody with some flow information and some historic, curtailment information produce for us an analysis of whether that's actually true. And then the next question becomes, have we built in enough time for application review for that to happen for those kinds of proposals?
Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah, we would definitely, that would be part of like the review team structure to be able to do that. And we definitely have staff that can help with that evaluations. But of course, we're gonna have to build that review structure and front load that time, which may, turn difficult since we're looking at a solicitation in October of this year. And just being able to line up those resources in time. But regardless, whenever we do, we will want to have that. And I do expect it.
Kristen, you've got your hand raised, and then Bob, I'd like to make sure you have a chance to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I guess just building on the conversation Heath and Andy just had, I would propose that for water acquisitions, and depending on where we go on the land side of things, we identify a separate technical review team that consists of people with the appropriate expertise to evaluate those, and also thoughtfully consider what of that review really falls to this committee deciding on funding, and what of that review is really subject to if it's a water master protected water transaction. In other words, it is a in-stream lease, in-stream transfer that will be regulated by the Oregon Water Resources Department. They also have steps in that process to assure the appropriateness of the transaction, making sure there isn't enlargement or injury to other water users and things like that. So we should be thoughtful about what parts of that review probably need to happen with, a qualified technical review team up front, and what parts of that, we'll sort of have as conditions on the approval of the grant in order to secure funding. The funding is proportionate to, ultimately the amount of water protected in stream and things like that. So we should avoid duplication of effort, but also have enough robust technical understanding up front.
Very good, Kristen. So like what I'm hearing so far is that we need to make sure that there's uplift or some additional benefit. And second, we need to make sure that it is durable and more permanent, just in case this group isn't here in the future. We need to make sure that the work that we do fund is durable.
That's correct. So avoiding, as Andrew said, putting, buying paper water that isn't really wet water would be a condition to demonstrate there is actually uplift, durability of the transaction, and also people with expertise to look at things like the third-party appraisal and relative appropriateness of the valuation, things like that. So we would need the right folks to, I think, weigh in on that and provide their advice to the committee. And Andrew has his hand up, so I'll stop. Sorry.
Well, I know, Bob, you might want to weigh in, but if I could just make one add-on to Kristen, which is we should look at OWEB's water acquisition program process and guidelines in order to inform what we do.
Yeah, no, and I agree with everything that's been said, including the caveats that have been added as well. So I'm good with this.
Great. So it sounds like we have kind of our first proposal to put forth on the regularly scheduled meeting, and that is to include a water rights acquisition track for this next solicitation, given the caveats that we've just discussed, and making sure that they're included. Is everybody on board with that? And we can task Andy with beginning work on that. Great.
Yeah, and I would just clarify, Chad, with the anticipation that, we strive to include it in this upcoming solicitation as best we can.
Right. That's a good point. And, as you were saying, there's a lot to try to get in place prior to the October solicitation. I think it is worth noting that if it's not, it's better to wait and let everybody know that we are going to be including it. We are developing it thoughtfully and carefully, rather than trying to rush something out that we regret. Is everybody kind of agreeing on that? I mean, we're going to work hard with the capacity that we have. But if it comes to the deadline and it's not there, I don't think we need to force it through. Kristen?
I agree with that. I also wanted to emphasize to your earlier point about until, we have an approved HCP, this program doesn't necessarily have longevity. So to the extent we were to consider water transactions that don't have the enforcement mechanism of the Oregon Water Resources Department behind them, I think we should be thoughtful about the duration of those agreements. So I guess to speak more directly, if it was a forbearance agreement, for example, or a minimum flow agreement, which are two mechanisms that are frequently used, we should be thoughtful if ultimately, we're the enforcement entity for compliance with those, that we don't have a period of performance that extends too far out at the risk that we wouldn't be there to steward those public funds to assure implementation.
Right.
Oh, that's
So we might want to
interesting.
limit our
So
initial
the-
offerings, I guess, to a narrower scope than ultimately what we might want to invest in the future.
So what you're saying, so I'm tracking, like a forbearance agreement would be the, farmer saying, hey, I'm going to volitionally not use all of this water, but that wouldn't necessarily be an in-stream lease that OWRD would regulate. It would require some kind of enforcement by the beneficiary under that agreement.
Correct.
Wow, that is super interesting. And in that circumstance, what you're saying is that this body may not persist long enough to actually enforce that over time. It seems likely to me that that's an appropriate role for like trusts, like land trusts or something of that nature, right? Like honestly, I don't know what I don't know, but those organizations exist over time and would have the ability to, enforce those entitlements. It seems beyond the duration of this body.
Yes, certainly that could be another strategy. So we would have a decision point, I think, Heath, about the level of risk we want to take on with those transactions, the level of credential that the applicant has, experience, financial stability that we believe they will in fact exist over the period of performance, things like that. So I think there's just degrees of risk that we might be willing to take on.
Or water trusts. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
That's
correct.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Or
a
other
thing.
organizations that do that
Yeah.
kind of work that maybe aren't necessarily organized as a trust. But that feels like a decision point that ultimately, as we put forward the criteria and project types that we're willing to entertain, should be a consideration, I guess, until the HCP is secured.
Yeah.
And if we decide to not accept applications for forbearances currently, that doesn't mean that, once the HCP is in place, we couldn't add that as another eligible project type over time. So I
Or
think
if
that's
it's an
also-
agreement that's 3 years in duration, we might feel comfortable with that versus a 15-year, or, we could also think about those things. So.
Right. And to Heath's point, we don't necessarily need to exclude forbearances at this point, but we would need to see that they are partnered with a water trust or some other organization to be the enforcement of that. And so then that project type could come to us and we would just evaluate it based on the other sets of criteria, and knowing that it comes with a higher risk or not. I don't know. I guess, what are the thoughts on, do we accept forbearances as an acceptable project type, or should we exclude them for now? I would just like to hear the group's thoughts on that so we can direct Andy appropriately.
I'd be inclined to leave them in, just with the caveat that that issue of sort of monitoring or enforcement, whatever the right word is, needs to be addressed.
I think that a scoring factor for them may be evidence of durability.
There you go. That's a clear metric that allows us to assign a score based on whether or not there's a water trust involved for a forbearance or not.
Or some other mechanism they identify.
Mm-hmm.
And by their nature, they tend to be temporary, just because if you forbear your water use under your water right forever, you're going to lose it, or at least part of
Right.
it. So that may be, but the flip side of that is maybe it doesn't score as high on its longevity and durability, right? Hey, this is only 3 years of benefit versus this permanent dedication of a water right in stream in
Mhm.
perpetuity.
I'll grapple with that though. Like it'll be hard to say, 3 years of increased water in the stream. I mean, how do we come to conclusions about how helpful that is? And we don't need to grapple with that here, but I need to figure that out. It does seem to me, Andy, that under Oregon's water rights system, that if they reduced their rate without, and still irrigated all of their acres, for instance, they shouldn't be subject to forfeiture. And so there's means of long-term reduction in water use without risk of losing your right.
Mhm.
That's what I was going to weigh into. Minimum flow agreements. I don't think there's a forfeiture risk, but yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, does that wrestle down the water side? Should we move to
I feel like it does.
land?
Andy, so we will just kind of summarize, we will be open to forbearances, and we will include a scoring metric of durability or permanence. All right, so that brings us to land, and I'd like to start with conservation easements, and then we can wrap up with fee acquisition and what we're thinking there. So Heath, you've got your hand up. Do you want to kick us off around conservation easements?
Well, you may have a plan there, Chad. I just had an observation coming out of the last meeting that may be helpful for framing. That kind of discusses both. Are you open to that?
Certainly.
I mean, like, what was interesting to me about listening to the OWEB conversation, and I had never really thought about it like this, is that at least OWEB, they really only take conservation easements, right? That is to say, they don't actually acquire any land in their own name. And what we learned there is that they will, in some circumstances, and under the program that we were reviewing, they will facilitate an acquisition by a third party, and that acquisition will be in connection with a conservation easement that OWEB takes. And the conservation easement really captures the conservation measures associated with the investment, right? That is to say, whether it's, keeping cattle off the creek, right? The conservation easement says we'll keep cattle off the creek. And then there's the land acquisition component that's separate and apart from that. And I asked him, I said, well, what good are you doing by facilitating the land acquisition itself? And that is to say, if in fact the conservation easement embodies the conservation uplift, that is to say, the things you were trying to accomplish ecologically, what is the purpose of the land acquisition to the degree that one presumes there's additional costs associated with that? And they said that in many circumstances, the implementation of the conservation measures gets so messy that it becomes very difficult for the landowner to even, for any reason, to continue holding the land. That is to say, you may have a small area where you're doing a lot of work, that the conservation measures anticipate a lot of investment, and that it doesn't leave a lot of room for practical management for other purposes. And that in those circumstances, it really made the most sense. The landowner didn't want to continue holding these lands subject to these conservation measures over long periods of time. And so for that reason, they would facilitate the acquisition by a land trust or some such thing. Honestly, that made a lot of sense to me. I mean, in the end, we're in the business of taking conservation easements, and those conservation easements enumerate the conservation measures that we are expecting in exchange for our money. And the acquisition component, to me, is a byproduct of circumstances where that conservation investment really necessitates the fee title transfer by virtue of either making continued ownership impractical, or that it just makes more sense that it be managed by a third party, held by a third party like a land trust. And so I just to me, that was kind of eye-opening. And you can see a circumstance where, at least from the political side, you know, we've kind of danced around this conversation for some time. And Mark, when those rules were adopted, you'll recall some robust conversations and some discomfort from me about those rules. But I do think that it kind of illuminated for me that really, you know, conservation easements can be so overbearing that they produce kind of the same outcomes that give me some concern. But we can talk about those in the context of those conservation easements and whether we're getting the uplift that we want. But at least then it requires that we enumerate what the conservation measures are, that what we think we're getting in terms of conservation uplift in the context of the conservation easement that we would be taking anyway. And then the secondary question is, if we impose these conservation measures and take this easement, does it make sense for that landowner to continue owning that land, or is it really make sense that the land ownership should be transferred as well? And that to me is kind of like a secondary question. So I don't know that that is a full answer to anything, but that framing kind of helped me coming out of that meeting. That is to say, we're buying conservation easements, we're enumerating the conservation uplift, we're making decisions to spend dollars on the efficacy of that conservation investment, and the acquisition component is really a tack on.
A byproduct of that. Yeah. Well, I think that is helpful, Heath. And another thing that I would like to discuss as a group is, you know, in the statute and in the author's report, it references the conservation easements in reference to development threats. And so do we want to stay on track with that and say a part of an easement would have to show threat to development in order to qualify? Or are we less concerned about that language of threats of development? Kristen, go ahead.
I think we could entertain a broad conversation about threats. I would be reluctant to limit it just to development unless we've inadvertently created some sort of statutory or rule that forces that. But my expectation, I think the value would be, you know, any of these projects consider a threat versus opportunity. And so maybe the threat is the ongoing degradation of an important resource that we want to, you know, reverse the trend on, or it could be a development threat. It could be something else. But I think that's just part of the conversation that supports whether or not a project makes sense on the ground. And I would not obligate all projects to have a threat of development as a precondition for funding.
Okay.
I also don't know how you define development. I mean, does it have to be a subdivision with paving, or is it development for some other industrial purpose? I mean, I think it's messy to go.
Yeah, that was just language that I had seen referenced in the author's report around the HCP handbook and conservation easements as a tool to address the threats of development. So that's kind of where that came from. And Bob, I'll give you a chance to add your piece here, and I'll just also say the other component that I want to talk about is it also states other than forest land specifically in the statute. And so how do we want to come to terms with that component? Are we going to focus on lower system agricultural lands and lands like that? Just some more things to think about as we continue the conversation. So with that, Bob, and then Marcus, your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was going to follow up on Kristen. I think it's, in my mind, it's more about uplift than necessarily about threats. I think threats are one component of what we need to be worried about, but I think really what we should be looking for is substantial uplift. I think that's, and threats just kind of just limits us to trying to stop things. I think many more of the opportunities are going to come on the other side of the equation. It's not going to be land that's threatened. It's going to be land where we can actually see improvement.
Great. And Mark, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, Heath, I was just going to add on to your comments, which I agree with. I think the other part and parcel of that is sometimes the opportunity to do a conservation easement or for those conservation benefits that might be codified in an easement occur because there's a change in land ownership. In other words, a previous landowner may, for whatever reason, want to sell their property, and a new landowner may be open to those types of uplift or conservation benefits or easements that a previous landowner had no interest in. So they sort of go hand in hand. You can't necessarily, without a willing landowner, the opportunity to get that conservation uplift may not exist.
I think so. I think that's right. That may be true, but I feel like what we're buying though is not the land. That is to say, there is no conservation benefit whatsoever to a land trust holding land in the abstract. That doesn't actually accomplish anything. The only thing that we are buying is imposition of the conservation measures associated with the conservation easement, right?
Well, I agree. I guess the other point though I'd make is that in reality, conservation easements can be really messy. So you want to have a landowner that is sort of philosophically aligned with the conservation easement that you're trying to own or enforce. And so sometimes different owners will be more receptive to it than others. And it's,
Oh, I agree. But I think that
so I'm just saying that's where the ownership issue comes into play.
I agree, but I think that the mistake would be the hypothetical that I raised in the last meeting. That is to say, in order to fence the creeks, you don't need to buy the ranch. And even if we have federal funders coming in to buy the ranch, if all told we're consuming $10 million to buy the ranch to accomplish what $15,000 of fencing would accomplish, then that's not a good use. Even if we're only putting $15,000 in, that's not a good use of conservation dollars overall, because the only conservation uplift you've realized is the fencing, and you've spent $10 million to accomplish that. And to me, that's the fundamental flaw. And I do think that if this group would focus on circumstances where the conservation easement is the thing we are buying, and that we will accommodate acquisitions when it's appropriate to implementation of those conservation measures, to implementation of the conservation easement, that to me makes a lot more sense than, putting us together with the Land and Water Conservation Fund and, 4 other funding sources to buy a whole cattle ranch just so that you can accomplish some fencing. And I realize that's an extreme hypothetical, but that's what I'm trying to capture.
That's a fair point, Heath. And Mark, I think that you're correct. The different management groups are going to have different objectives that will either be a barrier to having a conservation imposed on the property or not. And I think we may be surprised at who's willing to accept payment for conservation easements and who would rather just sell the property entirely. But yeah, that's a lot to wrestle with there. And to Heath's point, I think we really are buying conservation easements. And if the only way to purchase the conservation easement is through acquisition of the land that the easement is on, then it just becomes part of the project cost. And Heath, I think your concern is valid and could be addressed in how we score the projects around
Right.
efficiency of funding.
Right.
That is to say, we're comparing this conservation easement here that fences 10 miles of riparian habitat, and this one over here that fences the same 10 miles, but it includes acquisition of the property on top of.
Right.
When presented with those two projects, the efficient money is the conservation easement without buying the land.
Yes, under that hypothetical. Under an alternative hypothetical, and Kristen, if I may, I apologize, you can envision a circumstance where you're investing a lot of project work in a low-lying floodplain that's a corner right next to the stream emptying out into the Columbia or some such thing. And in that circumstance, there's almost no value left in the property anyway. That is to say, you're committing so much of this to conservation and conservation work that somebody kind of needs to own that, and you're going to transfer ownership to the land trust in order to accommodate those investments. That to me is a very different circumstance, and one that may very well merit the acquisition as a component of the investment.
Yep, excellent point. Kristen, you've got your hand up, and then Andrew, I'd like to make sure you've got a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, well, with some of the alignment that I think is emerging in the group, I I feel like it's impossible for us to envision all the hypothetical scenarios, and nor does this body need to be experts in it. That's really the role of the applicants to develop and design the project that makes sense and maximizes the ecological return in their estimation. So I wonder if, some of this time we should reserve to think about the kinds of questions for the application that we think would illuminate and help us, kind of guide that decision making sort of in broad strokes. So,
Yeah.
I think again, it's really getting down to articulating why the project is proposed in the manner it is, what the justification for the costs are, and most importantly, how this benefits the covered species that we're seeking to improve. And with that, kinds of buckets of information, I think we can avoid the pitfalls of trying to imagine every possible scenario, because we'll undoubtedly miss some. Not that it isn't important for the conversation. I'm not saying that isn't useful, Heath, but just, maybe we want to pivot to thinking about what information we need to guide those conversations. But let's hear from Andrew before we change subjects, if others agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, relatedly, and Heath, I know you were just putting out a hypothetical, and as you described it, an extreme hypothetical, but to what extent do we want to think beyond just where acquisition is necessary to achieve those conservation outcomes that are described in an easement or some other mechanism, versus when there are related benefits associated with the acquisition that are a priority for a community? And in particular, I'm thinking around drinking water and coastal communities where there is seemingly, as they grow. I interviewed for a different project the Seaside city manager and mayor, and they were like wanting to expand their protected watershed, right? So I'm not advocating for it as much as begging the question, to what extent do we integrate our objectives around listed species with, oh, the city wants to expand its protected watershed for its drinking water supply?
Yeah,
And I
Andrew, if I may, I think it's really important that we separate these buckets. And there are other groups with other objectives and other funding, and that is what that funding is for. And we had no problem spending over what we had asked for, and there were still really good projects below that funding line. And I would hate to see us put even more projects below that funding line, because we've tried to align ourselves with some other set of objectives that does not accomplish the uplift that we're trying to achieve under the HCP. That's my own personal feelings, but it is a good point to talk about.
Yeah, Chad, the only addendum I would add on that is it would have to provide the uplift that we were seeking to, obviously. But I guess the question is, do we want or not to sort of try to leverage our ecological objectives with other related objectives, whether they be municipal water supply or parks and open space even too? And I'm not advocating either way. And again, we'd have to have the uplift before we'd want to integrate in with those.
Yeah, and I would, Chad said it better than I could, but one addition that I would make to that is, Andy, I think in terms of the work of this body, it becomes a lot more complicated when we begin scoring given other priorities. That is to say, priorities outside the context of the HCP. I appreciate that there may be co-benefits with these projects, but from my perspective, how we approach those co-benefits, how we rank those co-benefits, this group is just not very suited to making those decisions. And as Chad says, if the appetite for money persists in the manner we saw in the last funding cycle, I think we really run the risk of co-benefits otherwise deprioritizing investments on behalf of the species that we would otherwise make. And so in my view, I think personally, I think that there's some real benefit to actually drawing a pretty crisp line for this group. That is to say, the factors that we're going to consider for purposes of awarding grants are the factors relevant to the covered species.
Yeah, one more point if I could, Chad. I completely
Certainly.
concur. I guess I'm just envisioning a proposal that says, hey, we're $50,000 short to complete this acquisition, which is primarily being driven by Seaside's desire to improve its protected watershed. But we can enumerate these benefits for listed species of this acquisition, which you put $50,000 into the pot. That's the only thing I'm kind of playing around in my head. Not that we're leveraging these other objectives to get to our objectives, and we'd have to be able to get to our objectives.
Well, Andrew, I'll just say, and then I'd like to make sure Bob has time to respond, is what we've discussed so far does not prevent them from doing that.
Right.
What we've discussed so far is talking about a conservation easement, and if the acquisition is necessary in order to achieve that easement, none of that precludes them from being able to do what you just described.
Yeah.
We just aren't looking at the co-benefit component. And I think to Heath's point, drawing that crisp line, it does offer a little bit of protection for the committee members from pressures from outside groups trying to say, you know, you need to work on prioritizing human health and you need to feel more strongly about our communities. And there could be some pressure there applied if we create a pathway that maybe the committee members don't necessarily need to be subject to. So just another thought. And with that, I'd make sure to let Bob speak, and then Kristen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, we asked the question, what other species does this benefit above and beyond the covered species? And I don't think it's bad to get information on what co-benefits are out there as well. I think it's kind of useful context. It also sometimes raises questions about, are you actually doing this for this purpose, or is this real? How much of this really is a priority and how much of this is just an add-on? So I like having that information. That being said, I agree with the idea that we need to focus on the covered species and the benefits to them. And I think based on the fact that this is mitigation for a habitat conservation plan, I don't think we have any real flexibility there. I don't think we can start to elevate projects as they do other good things over projects that truly benefit the species more. I think because it's tied to an HCP, we're really obligated to look at that and pretty much that exclusively. But again, the context I think is useful in terms of the application.
Well said, Bob. The context is helpful, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. Kristen?
I would just say I agree with everything just said in that conversation. I could also, after my argument against hypothetical scenarios, I'll put one forward. My argument would be, in a case where the majority of the acquisition is really related to benefits that are maybe outside of the charge of this particular committee, you could see a proposal come forward that was requesting funding to, say, implement some riparian restoration that's a component of that acquisition, and all of the objectives and measurable outcomes and budget that's presented is associated, with those restoration actions. So in a scenario where it's a $2 million acquisition, they're asking for $50,000 from us. If that investment is really tied specifically to some of those actions, that could be a way that brings in co-benefits without sort of undermining, I guess, the charge of this committee or how our funding's invested. So again, I think those are all strategies applicants could use as they develop their proposal and application.
Yeah, and I think that they'd have to have very clear budget guidelines on how the money is to be spent to make sure that it is truly to fund the conservation work happening and not just going into a bigger bucket of money. And when we get around to it, we'll put some wood in that creek. Right. So what you're describing is not all that different than what we talked about with the warehouse or culvert removal. When you're already there doing the culvert work and you have machines on site, if you would like to add to the work you're doing by doing some large wood placement or some stream enhancement, that makes sense. We're not going to fund the culvert, but we'll fund the conservation work. That's what you've described is we're not going to fund the land acquisition, but we will fund the conservation component as long as it has clear budget guidelines.
And not saying we wouldn't fund land acquisition where for all the other scenarios we described. I'm just sort of going off
in that hypothetical.
A different, correct.
Keith?
For what it's worth, though, this is where I start falling apart a little bit. Like Andy, like your $50,000, if you'll pitch in 50 grand to support, the $5 million acquisition of this block of timberland and a drinking watershed, that to me is kind of like the fence in the creek, scenario. That is to say, and I don't know that it works that way. I think what happens is that it's one big conservation easement, and we are one of the beneficiaries under the conservation easement, and it's not really isolated and separate to us. And so what it means is we are funding $50,000 of something that was probably going to happen anyway. And boy, we saw that on our applications this last funding round. And for me, there's kind of a but-for question. That is to say, is it really the case that but for our money, that conservation won't happen? That is to say that the fence won't be cricked. Wow, that the fence won't be cricked. That's a good one. I'm going to remember that. And then that's coming from the timber attorney. But the other question is like, is it the case that those other funders are all also claiming that conservation uplift, right? That is to say, are we funding, $50,000 for $50,000 of stream work, or are we funding 50,000 over 5 million, right? That fraction of the stream work that's being done. And because all of those other funders are participating in that as well. And if that's the case, then again, we have just utilized a very expensive means of accomplishing that conservation outcome because it's been coupled with acquisition of this timberland for other purposes that this body's not serving. And so I genuinely don't know how to tackle that. I feel like there's probably some like smart econometrics, out there on this, but I really want this group to know I will struggle with those circumstances where we're a tack on where I feel like this is conservation that's likely already going to happen and they're just looking for more money to plus up the purchase price.
Yep. That's a fair analysis, Heath. And I think it also does bring us back to the question originally of, are we entertaining any of this on forest lands where it is specifically called out as on other than forest lands?
And that's right.
So we can get to that, but first I want to make sure that Bob and Kristen have a chance to weigh in before we talk about, are we going to limit these to other than forest lands as set forth in the statute and author's report, or are we going to have discussion around that? So Bob and then Kristen. Bob, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, my dogs were howling. I think the but-for question is a good one, Heath, but I also think there's a reality to the way projects get funded too, where, people are scrambling around trying to pull money sources in to do big projects that, it's a very legitimate question, but I think it's just a reality of how things get funded too. And we just need to be vigilant about that and really look for, to make sure that we are really getting value for our contribution. And that's oftentimes sorting out of all the different pieces of the puzzle. I do think there are cases where we should be thinking, I think we should be thinking about forest lands. And I think in particular, I think about things like inholdings in state forests and some places like that, where you have key watersheds that are, vulnerable to development, vulnerable to different kinds of uses not being improved. I think there are cases like that where it does make some sense to potentially acquire land and add it to a system. I also think there are some opportunities that I mentioned at the meeting last time where, for example, the Beaver project or some of the Beaver projects that may come forward where, there's educational opportunities. There's some opportunity to actually purchase a piece of land and use it in a different way to enhance our species. I'm thinking there particularly about the beaver relocation efforts that are going to come under the PFA. Those will probably require a facility and land to do that. So I think there are some interesting opportunities out there to acquire land very strategically and thoughtfully. I don't think we have the money to do massive land acquisition funding, but I do think there are going to be some cases that will pop up. And I think we ought to think about questions for how we narrow that scope carefully.
Yep. Very good, Bob. I appreciate that. Kristen, I'll give you a chance, and then Heath, but I do want to remind the group we've got about 10 minutes left, and we do need to get some more kind of consensus here around with what we did with water. Let's try to get there with land and conservation easements. So, Kristen?
That's actually where I was going to try to take the group, was just a reminder, we'll need to get to a recommendation. I do want to say I concur with what Bob Salinger just offered. I wonder if, and I'm trying to go back to the conversations we had with the provision about other than forest lands. I think there may be very good opportunities to do the work that this body is intended to if we include forest lands. And I wonder if the intention of that from the timber side of having that pulled in was more about preserving working lands or maximizing kind of working lands opportunities. And it seems that could be a question that's part of the proposal scenario, is to understand that. And I would presume that agricultural interests would also have those questions. And so I think understanding, making sure that we have a question that assesses sort of the economic community, those components of it, could help us to tease out and be able to wrestle in a more sophisticated way with the questions around, if it is a timber acquisition, what does that mean for your industry? So I would just put that forward as a way that we could include timberlands, but make sure we have the information needed for the group to understand the relative impacts of it. And then I would like to, after Heath speaks, maybe have a conversation about timing and the relative cost of investing some of the PFA resources in order to stand up these acquisition programs.
Well, we have more to do than we can do in the time that's remaining. I agree with all of those, Kristen. Bob Salinger, I just wanted to make an analytical point that I think that the inholdings question is precisely what I'm opposing. That is to say, I don't think by acquiring an inholding, you are actually accomplishing anything by way of conservation, absent some material changes to how the inholding is managed. That is to say, transferring ownership from an industrial timberland owner to a land trust of an inholding doesn't change anything about that inholding unless it comes coupled with measures that are going to be implemented in management of that land that we believe are actually producing conservation uplift. And so, I just wanted to highlight that analytically, that's kind of precisely what I'm getting at is, and I bet you don't disagree. I just didn't want it to be presumed that the transfer of the ownership alone means that we are getting uplift. Otherwise, the Curtis family is going to start proposing some acquisitions.
Yeah. Well, we got a thumbs up from Bob, and I do think we're all agreeing on that point. So with that, Andy, can we talk about timelines and costs? And we do, clearly need to have another meeting of this group to iron out some of the details that were just discussed there.
Yeah, I didn't know if Kristen had an idea. It sounded like she had some stuff on the hopper there, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about some timeline and costs.
You should start it off, Andy. Thanks.
Definitely, I would recommend another meeting. Maybe we have another one next month, and I can prep some documents ahead of time. What Kristen was kind of mentioning earlier, some questions and whatnot. So we can start showing the public in the application how we're narrowing stuff down. I would like to, if, again, we're looking at October 1 for our next solicitation, just as a quick reminder, October 1 to November 30. That will be our open solicitation window. We've extended the review process this year a bit. It is, we're expected to go again to spring of next year to commission. We're going to follow a very similar timeline of approval, but we've extended the review process by about a month. If we really want to include this, I'm thinking draft solicitation, RFP, the request for proposals, or the grant guidelines, also known as. I'm trying to have that drafted by the end of August. Really get approved, drafted in August, approval in September from the committee for 2024, launch in October. So realistically, we would need to get a plan June and July, for acquisition to get included in that draft August solicitation. I had no recommendation on funding on if we want to do any limits. I mean, I would see that, maybe we see what we get this year and move forward, or whenever we do implement the program and go from there. That's kind of what I'm
Andy,
thinking.
I meant more the cost from the staff and administration side. If we have additional DOJ review expenses, things like that.
Yes,
The cost,
we
not
will.
the funding cap. So it would be helpful maybe next time we're together to have some
Put
idea
that
of
together.
what's entailed there so we can think about it.
Is
Yeah,
it?
I can come back with the report from DOJ.
May I make one proposal? And you don't have to go with this, but rather than try and assemble this entire group, a month out, I personally would be comfortable with Kristen and Chad working on these details and bringing a proposal to the next meeting, the next actual meeting of the Mitigation Advisory Committee, rather than trying to assemble all of us again. I wanted to throw that out there. I feel like, Kristen, you've raised some really good points, and I'm comfortable with you and Chad grappling with those points.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence, Heath. I'm certainly fine with that. I just want to also get the opinions of the rest of the folks here, with the understanding that I don't have all the tools to be able to make informed proposals, and I will be reaching out to everyone that is on this call as we're discussing this. I know that with Mark's experience with conservation easements and TNC, and with Andrew's experience with water rights, with you and Bob, I will need to reach out to you for individual conversations, but I'm happy to push the work forward with Kristen.
I would love to have Mark and Andrew, particularly with their experience in these spaces. I think there's kind of two pieces. There's the structuring of the process and evaluating those considerations. And then there's some of the bigger policy questions that we've been talking about today, which certainly warrant this whole collective group of people,
Right.
as well as probably other members that aren't here. And so, if we can, somehow separate those
Yes.
tasks in a way that's meaningful, but we don't lose, the important input of everybody here, and other members of the committee that couldn't make it. Yeah.
We lost Andrew Perkey. Here he comes back. Well, we're just a little over. Heath, that's a great point. Kristen and I will continue to work on this. We will continue to reach out to individual members to bring their expertise. We will likely have another meeting. And for now, Andy, do you have what you need to kind of work on water rights, which we all agreed on, and that gives you something to begin working on now? We can
Yes.
start to talk about conservation easements as well, who would hold them. You can prepare what the budget would look like for DOJ review and support, and you can bring that back to us.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I get you some estimates, when we're talking about budget, they charge by the hour and whatnot, but I can get some metrics there on what changes when we talk about,
Great.
acquisition.
And then on the projects on forest land or off forest land, I think the point is that we're not trying to take productive timberlands out of the supply for our wood products manufacturers. And I know there is only increased sensitivity around that as the state HCP is moving forward. And so I just, in order to not become a lightning rod of the industry and do something that's clearly outlined as we were not going to in the negotiations, if we were to consider doing something on forest lands, Kristen, I think your point is well made that it would have to come with an inclusion that it's not going to take productive lands out of production, right? So if there is other conservation measures that can be taken to provide uplift through a conservation easement or acquisition on forest lands, that's all well and good. We can explore that, but it needs to be caveated with it's not going to reduce that available timber supply.
I don't think that was quite my point. I think I was saying we should consider the overall scope of the project, impact on working lands and those things relative to the weight of the benefit to the HCP species, and be able to, as a group, have a conversation around the relative pros and cons of that particular application. So I would be reluctant to draw a hard line that there can't be any potential reduction whatsoever in,
Mhm.
board
Yeah.
feet produced. I think we would miss good opportunities if we did that. What I was saying is I think we should have questions in the application that can help us wrestle those competing interests in a way that's strategic, thoughtful, and can, well considers that concern that you're raising, which
Well,
is a valid. But does that make
I-
sense? Like, I think we just need to understand that.
I think that works, and I do think the information should be there. I do note though that in terms of weighting, like I do feel like that was bargained for language in both the PFA report and the statute. And I appreciate that there's blanket authorization at the end of the statute to do a lot of things, but I think that these investments off of the covered lands was really a vision of making conservation and easement investments in ways that would really minimize those impacts. And that was what I was trying to get at. Again, if it was so much money, and a lot of industry money, especially in the context of negotiations around like a severance tax for communities and stuff, to the degree that we were going to be investing this kind of money, I didn't want to see it going to retiring productive timberland. And I don't think anybody wants that, but I just have to say the piece that was really important to me. And there's so
I'm
many
not
good
arguing
projects.
against that at all,
Yes.
Heath.
Yes.
That's not I just am reluctant to draw artificial hard boundaries that I think we can wrestle with the appropriateness of things in that context.
Fair
Was
enough.
all I was, yeah. But I agree with what you're saying fully.
All right. Well, we are 5 minutes past. I do try to keep meetings on time, so we are going to convene the meeting. Andy, do you have everything that you need?
Sure.
Yeah, did we want to propose another time for our next working group meeting? Or were we gonna discuss that more and what that looked like?
Well, we have got another MAC meeting coming up in early May. Is that correct, Andy?
Correct.
So maybe we come up with the time during that meeting when other committee members are present.
Got it.
And
Thank you.
because we're not going to take another 10 minutes to pull out our calendars. There's 6 people on this call. That'll take a while.
And Chad, do you envision then that maybe you and Kristen come back to the next MAC meeting with at least a draft or some initial thoughts that you're able to pull together? I think that would help.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
catalyze the conversation.
We can
Yeah,
work with
and
Andy to
it'll-
do that.
It'll
Thank
likely come as a proposal, and we would ask that someone in this group then make a motion to adopt that so that we can, as a group, vote to create
Well,
the
I think
guidelines.
I guess it depends how far you get. I mean, I was envisioning maybe you get to a draft stage where we all have the opportunity to look at it, and that catalyzes another conversation.
At the very least,
I
a
know-
strong proposal.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mark. I don't think
Great.
it's a yes or no, but something that we can really facilitate a fast conversation around.
Yeah.
One thing that I really want to be mindful of is the capacity to get this done and the timeline out. And so, Andy, we'll be somewhat dependent on you to think about that and the viability of doing these pieces and what that looks like. That remains a concern of just, is it feasible to do this before October? And if not, what's the alternative strategy around that? Be it delaying the entire solicitation? Is it phased rollout of different parts of the acquisition program? What makes sense and what's efficient? So,
Yep, thank you. Follow up with you guys.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for participating today and look forward to seeing you in May.
Thank you.